14. Great, so we now have 14 people on. A few people just joined a moment ago, so let's wait a second and welcome everybody. Thanks very much for joining. That may be everyone, and we'll get started then. So I'm Will Masters from Tufts University, really happy to have been able to put together this AAEA invited session. My experience with ASSA meetings is that there's so often snow on the ground, ice, and we have that in Boston today. So that's in honor of ASSA. And this session is about food prices. So we have 4 great papers to share, and really appreciate all the speakers and you for joining. The question is, what do food prices reveal about access to nutrition, right? In the sense of whether an overall healthy diet is actually available at a given time and place at an affordable cost. So this is work that our first speaker, that Bob Allen, really brought to the forefront of economics with that 2017 AER paper that used the cost and affordability of nutrients as a way of measuring absolute poverty in place of real preference, in a way that really dramatically showed the very high cost of nutrients in today's food systems. And his first paper in the session today is going to be about that in economic history. But since that AER paper at Tufts, we've been able to do a lot of work on this question in this project called Food Prices for Nutrition, first to refine and update the nutrient requirements. So the definition of healthy diet is that we're using in our project in lots of papers, thanks to Anna Herforth, who's on the panelist, a co-author in the last paper. And then we bring vastly more data on retail item prices. So it's hundreds of items at thousands of marketplaces around the world every month, and converting those into standard units to get the results you'll see. So that's the paper that Ash Venkat will present third. Before that, we'll have 2 papers on economic history. First, Bob Allen's on the 18th century in England. Then Mikhail Matzos will present this amazing work on with the OECD on 19th and 20th century history across a number of countries, and how the access to nutrients evolved and the cost of accessing this sort of food supply part of the health production function evolved in economic history in 19th and 20th century. Then this contemporary work that I just mentioned from, it's actually 2 different Tufts PhD students. Ash Venkat will present, and it's joint with Jess Wallingford, asking how prices in low and middle income countries have evolved to change access to nutrients under extreme shock conditions, concerned with extreme weather and climate shocks, and concerned with COVID and COVID response. And then our concluding paper, which I think is really the punchline of the story and an opportunity for lots of people to share thoughts in the Q&A, is from Nada Hamadeh from the Development Data Group of the World Bank, on how they plan to be working with member governments to use these methods to guide policy. So the last 2 papers are part of this Food Prices for Nutrition project. So if you're curious, encourage you just to Google that. It's also a hashtag on Twitter. We're using the hashtag ASSA 2022. If you want to tweet about the activities that we're doing here. Food Prices for Nutrition is all one word, of course. And for this conversation right now, just use the Q&A box. So I'll keep an eye on the Q&A, and we'll interrupt speakers when there's a clarifying question that seems like it should be addressed right away. Speakers will aim to close in good time for me to relay questions from the Q&A into conversation. And then we should have some time at the very end for a roundup of the Q&A, comments, questions, thoughts you've had about this work. I think this work touches on activities that all of the attendees probably are doing in some way in their work. I recognize some of the names. People are doing amazing work with different kinds of data for which I believe these 4 papers will really resonate. So Bob, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Will. It's a pleasure to be here. And I guess I should be going to share my screen. And I want to, why is this not, oh, here we go. I don't know how to operate anything. All right, so can you see the screen now? And can you see my?
Not quite yet.
Oh, not quite yet. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Now you see my screen.
Excellent. Yep. But not the
Okay.
presentation.
You see the presentation now?
Yes, but not in presentation mode. We just see your screen without the presentation mode.
I don't know why that's happening.
If you don't have any
I got
animations,
it. I clicked it up. Why don't I just do it this way? If you can see
this is
it.
fine.
And-
Yep. Very
Okay.
good.
So the theme of the question of the paper, this is the historical question, is what did the potato do for us? And by us here, I mean Northern Europeans and people living in Northern North America, where it's cold and things don't grow in the winter. But the other subtext in the way that this is going to be answered is what does duality and linear programming do for us? And that may be of more general interest, I hope, than the history of the potato. But nonetheless, I like potatoes. So here we go. So the potato was a new food in Europe. It was introduced from the Americas as part of the Columbian Exchange. First cultivated in Spain, then it appears in the Netherlands and England at the end of the 16th century. It was initially a food that the rich ate as a kind of delicacy, and later it was taken up by the poor. It's commonly consumed in England by the middle of the 18th century, and Beveridge's price history of England begins to show regular price quotations from 1760 onward. So why was the potato adopted? The common view is that it was a cheap source of calories. I would go to Wikipedia for the common view, where they point out the potato had a large effect due to the fact that it yield about 3 times the calories per acre of grain. So this is a kind of common theme. It does, however, if you look at the prices, it's not noticeably a cheaper source of calories than oatmeal or barley, which were the cheap grains that people ate. And indeed, there's no change in the ratio of the prices of oatmeal to wheat or barley to wheat over this whole period. So if you imagine a kind of diff and diff framework, you wouldn't just looking at the data, you don't notice any diff and diff in this, like it doesn't look like there's an impact. But we can press this further with linear programming. So vegetables are particularly important as sources of vitamins, and vitamin C in particular, at least, especially in the simple linear programming models that I've been using. Vegetable prices, of course, fluctuate a lot over the year. With high vegetable prices in the winter, you might expect a vitamin C issue in the winter, and indeed there was one. This is part of one of my themes. Potatoes, which are a good source of vitamin C, had a stable price over the year. And so they might be important in addressing the winter vitamin C issue, which I will show. But to explore all this, we can't proceed with annual data. We have to look at seasonal data. So we're going to have winter models and summer models to try to capture what's going on. Now, one of the things that's really tricky for me doing this historically is there are not a lot of vegetable prices recorded. There's all sorts of other prices routinely recorded, but I think many institutions and many individuals grew their own vegetables. So the marketing of vegetables just wasn't as important and it didn't generate prices. But I did find this book by Richard Weston on tracks on practical agriculture and gardening. Weston had an axe to grind. He wrote this book for gardeners who were supplying London with vegetables at Covent Market. And he has seasonal price data because he makes this point that a lot of vegetables like cabbages, for instance, down here, were about 10 times more expensive in late February or March than they were in the high summer when they were being harvested. So he was arguing, he has plans for cold frames and is arguing for cold frame production of vegetables in the winter and with kind of cost benefit arguments. But other foods, I mean, I'm not looking in any detail, they don't have much seasonality in prices, certainly compared to vegetables. So that's what we want to investigate. There's a complication. We are going to be looking at potatoes here, but a new potato is not the same as an old potato. The vitamin C level declines with storage over the course of the year. And I found this very old article in Nature that shows how this goes down. So I presume it looks like the nutritional data I have for potatoes give values like the summer values for vitamin C. So I'm cutting them in half for winter values when I do the analysis. So what we're going to do is we're going to do linear programming for the summer and the winter. And we're going to start off with a normal primal problem and then look at the dual problem. So the primal problem is to choose quantities of food to minimize the cost of achieving a specified nutritional requirements. And the information to do this that you need is a list of possible foods, their prices. You have to specify the nutritional requirements to be met, and you have to have nutritional compositions of the foods. And I have to bear in mind that my winter vitamin C for potatoes is going to be different from my summer one. So in the present situation, we're doing London around 1770. This is a list of the foods that I use. If anyone wants to see in detail, they were most of the standard foods that people at the time ate. Eggs, butter eggs, dried beans, flour, bread, potatoes, a bunch of different meats, lard, sugar, raisins, currants, oatmeal, peas, snap beans, cauliflowers, cabbages, other things, all right? And the nutritional requirements are putting in are the ones for what I call my basic diet and work I've done before, which includes vitamin C, which is important here. So, okay, let's run the LP program like that. And look here at the column on the right. This is the solution for the summer. So the diet, this is an annual cost, is 542 pence. And the foods, we get barley and oatmeal, mostly, well, very large, gravy beef, lard, and cabbage, which is our vitamin C source. This looks like a Northern English diet. This looks like a medieval London diet, but 18th century London diets are much better than this because there's been a lot of economic development and progress from the Middle Ages. Okay, now we're going to run it for the winter. So the cost of the diet is more than it is in the summer. It goes up to 571, and this is the solution. It's got less barley, it's about the same amount of oatmeal, 150 kilograms of potatoes, the same amount of meat, and pretty much the same amount of lard, right? So we get potatoes in here, and they cost more. So the first most elementary thing to say is, what did the potato do for us? Is to say, let's suppose what happens if we don't have potatoes? So we take them out of the model and we resolve it, and we get this. And the price here goes up to 648. In fact, the solution is the solution to the summer primal problem, right? You just go to cabbage for your vitamin C, but it costs a lot more because this is in the winter with a much higher price of cabbages. So we could be perverse now and we could say, well, let's get rid of the cabbages too. What happens then? So we re-estimate it, the price goes up to 793. This stuff's about the same here. That's about the same, sorry, here. And cauliflowers now replace cabbages at a higher cost. And that's the 18th century spelling of cauliflower, by the way. So we could do it again and get rid of cauliflowers, and the price goes up now to over 1,000 pence. And we've got the carbohydrates default to beans, and we get a whole bunch of currants and a vast amount of lettuce. So that's what happens. Well, we can press, so it looks like the vitamin C sources are very expensive and becoming more so, but we can analyze this, probe this by looking at the dual problem. So the dual diet problem is to aim is to work out the monetary value of nutrients themselves. And what we do is we choose, so it's another kind of, we can do it with the same Excel program on almost the same way. Here we're choosing prices of nutrients to maximize the value of nutrients required in the specification of the LP. So we're taking the requirements and treating those as quantities from the last problem and saying, and coming up with prices for the various nutrients. And we want to make the value of the nutrients as high as we can. And so we have an objective function of this form. So the first term is calories. So we have the value of calories. That's what we're going to get out of the program. That's going to be calories per value. That's going to be pence per kilogram of vitamin C. And this is the annual vitamin C requirement, 2,100 calories a day times 365 days. So that's a fixed number. We put that in. We do the same thing with protein, where you have 50 grams a day of required protein. So that's the annual requirement. And we're going to get the value of protein. So forth for everything. And the last one's going to be vitamin C. And it turns out it's 0.014 kilograms of vitamin C over the year. And we're going to get the value of vitamin C. And this is subject to the implied value of the nutrients in each required food. And that has to be less than or equal to the price of the food. So we get, for cheese, there'll be an equation for each food. So the value per kilogram of calories times the calories per kilogram of cheese, plus the same thing for proteins and all the vitamins, has to be less than or equal to the price of a kilogram of cheese. So the left side of this is the value of the nutrients in a kilogram of cheese, and it has to be less than or equal to the price of cheese. When you solve the problem, the equality holds for the foods in the primal solution. And for all the other foods, the value of their nutrients is less than the price of the food. So here's the answer if we do this for the winter. This is the winter stuff. The cost of the diet with, so we look down here, this is the cost of the diet, 542 calories with everything in it. Why is this different? That's a mistake. It's 571. And then as we go through and eliminate different foods, we can do that and we get different values of calories, in nutrients. And so it works like this. So as we think about having all the foods in this diet, or no potatoes, and then no potatoes and no cabbage, and no potatoes, cabbage, and cauliflower, the cost of the diet goes up. We saw that from the primal, and it comes out in the dual. If we look at these other nutrients, their prices don't change very much at all. And in particular, so the ones that are zero are ones that are in excess supply in the primal solution, and the ones that are positive are they're the constraints. They're the requirements that are exactly met for those. But here, like as we get rid of potatoes, the value of calories does not go up, right? As we get rid of potatoes, the only thing that goes up is the value of vitamin C. And as we get rid of now, all the things, the value of vitamin C in the winter was always higher than the value in the summer. Oh, this is the summer solution. That was confusing me. That's the summer solution. That's the winter solution. The value of calories in the winters, even the most generous set of food availability, is much higher than the summer. And as you get rid of cheap calorie source foods, the value of calories goes higher and higher and higher as the cost of the diet's going higher and higher. So the question was, what did the potato do for us? It was not a cheap source of calories. What it did, was it reduced the cost of vitamin C in the winter. And in that way, it improved the health of Northern Europeans. That was the contribution of the potatoes to good health. And what duality did in linear programming was allow us to show this quite precisely. We can see what the value of each of the nutrients is, how the value increases as we knock out the various foods that we think are seasonally important, and we can get a sense of what matters and what doesn't in terms of the cost of the diet for the nutritional requirements we want season by season. And it's also important, of course, this shows to do a seasonal analysis, right? Because in Northern Europe, anyway, it makes a lot of difference. That's my presentation. Thank you.
That is such a great story. Fascinating, Bob. So attendees are welcome to enter comments, thoughts, questions in the chat box. If not, we'll move directly on to Mikhail's presentation. Although I do want to, so Mikhail, you could begin to share while we're doing that. Bob, I just wanted to reflect on one thing, which is, nutrient requirements for health have been evolving quite a lot.
Right.
And so a big problem with potatoes as a source of vitamin C, is that they come with this huge carbohydrate load, which is seen to have cardiovascular and weight trajectory issues. So addressing the vitamin C deficiencies with potatoes could be really good for immune function and have helped limit disease burdens because people had this access to cheaper vitamin C at some cost of the carbohydrate load and its consequences on metabolism. So it's very interesting to see how the food supply changes the health production function.
Yeah, it is. So I mean, there's a lot of imprecise literature that suggests there really was a lot of scurvy in the Middle Ages in the winter, right? When there were no potatoes, and yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, interesting. That's terrific. Thank you.
Okay.
Please do enter in the Q&A if you have other thoughts. We'll come back to these these questions. But Miko.
Yeah. Okay, now you can hear me, I suppose.
Excellent. Yes, thank you.
Great. So hi, my name is Michael Matos, and I'm from the Department of History and Art History in Utrecht University. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the confidence intervals and long-run trends in food prices, the cost of basic needs, and global poverty. So the goals of this paper are fourfold. So first of all, to use the cost of basic needs, global poverty, and identify its levels and trends. Do that in a way that allows us to also say something about the confidence intervals around these estimates. So not just delivering point estimates. In doing so, necessarily one also gets the trends and levels in the food prices because of the data that are being used in the estimation of the cost of basic needs poverty line as a consumption basket. And a step in doing that also involves the estimation of the affordability of the healthy diet globally and on the long run. Maybe this is too many goals for a short paper. So bear with me because there are a number of shortcuts in the procedure, in the methodology, which I hope to convince you that they do not interfere with the validity of the results in the end. Yeah, so in general, being able to estimate global poverty is something that it's only possible since, let's say, very recently. The seminal paper in the literature comes from 1991, and it was only applicable for the developing world back then. So the data availability only since the late 70s can allow us to, let's say, have a glimpse of what was going on in terms of poverty, and only for a very small number of years. At the same time, the constraints of global price data did exactly help the situation in implementing cost of basic needs based methods for measuring global poverty. And other methods have been applied, well, notably the dollar a day approach of the World Bank in this matter. Well, since then, there have been at least two sources of price data that have become available. One is the ICP, the International Comparison Program, an activity that is under the auspices of the World Bank, perhaps the largest statistical activity around the world. And there are data, precious data that are accessible to the research community. Well, I can tell for sure for the 2011 round. I'm not so sure about the 2005 and the 2017 rounds, but that remains to be seen. And at the same time, on a historical dimension, we have a unique set of a unique statistical exercise that took place from 1924 until 2008 uninterruptedly by the International Labour Organization. This is the October inquiry that collected price data specifically of items and of price levels that were of products that were consumed by working families, so not overall average prices. And Unfortunately, this series has stopped being updated in 2008 when ILO decided to steer its resources to other activities. These and some other price sources that, like the World Food Program of the United Nations, these are price sources that have a global reach and do facilitate the implementation of cost of basic need approaches for a global poverty measurement. Okay, so let me be brief about the method applied here. Well, luckily, Alan said a few words about the basic model. I will say a few more. So in the OECD, in the work we did for the OECD in 2021, there I used the Alan's basic model as a specification to define extreme poverty. And that allows for a specific amount of calories per day, protein and fat. And it also contains the Indian recommended daily allowances for 6 types of nutrients, for 6 nutrients. In that exercise, I have used the ILO prices to price those poverty lines for the whole 1820 and 2018 period with linear programming. Of course, this involves, as I will say later on, some extrapolations and interpolations. Otherwise, we wouldn't get 200 years of estimates. So the way the data from ILO mostly involves food prices. There are additional prices, but they are more scattered. So in that exercise, what I did, I basically estimated the first part of the component, what Alan calls the CPF poverty line, or the CPF food basket, which contains the 2,100 calories per day, the 50 grams of protein, and the 34 grams of fat. And on that, I applied a couple of multipliers. First multiplier had to do with the, sorry for the back and forth. First multiplier had to do with the upgrade of the nutrient content. So from CPF to the basic model, that includes the additional nutrients allowances. So that added some cost. And a second, this will not be, that multiplier is not that relevant here because I'm going to be using the Eat Lancet estimates from Hirvonen and his colleagues. So that multiplier doesn't need to us. The second multiplier, though, is important. And this multiplier allows us to go from a food component to a full-fledged poverty line. And this is the poverty line food share in the estimates that Bob has provided in his 2017 AER paper. So this has only a few observations here, but still it does give you a trend. And this is the let's say the trend of the poverty line food share as GDP per capita increases. So it goes from about 75% at very low GDP levels per capita all the way down to 20-25% at high levels of GDP per capita. So I use that framework, and as I told you, I substituted the food component from the CPF to the more rich Eat Lancet healthy diet, reference diet, that has been estimated for the 2011 ICP data by Hirvonen and colleagues. And the non-food component has been applied as a multiplier based on this simple exercise that I showed you before. So in the above, so since we have the Eat Lancet food estimate, food component estimate for 2011 only, I'm using the ILO food price data to estimate the changes in price. And I'm doing that in order to deflate and inflate the Eat Lancet diet back and forth in time. And I'm doing that using the linear programming approach that has been applied for the OECD paper. That basically is being turned into a price index. So this is, let's say, what's the overview of the ILO October inquiry data for 1924 until 2008. This exercise also includes wage data, but we're not going to talk about that here. The number of countries has increased from about 15 in 1924 all the way up to 136 in the top years involved here. There are some ups and downs after the Second World War. The number of products included, had to do with the layout of the questionnaire that the ILO was using in the first few years. Only 15 products were used, more or less. That increased to amount of 30, and then to 40, 46 products after the 1985 update. And the average products per country overall, they are about 20 to 22 products per year per country. Of course, this is not comparable with the ICP data that are being gathered, but this gives you quite a lot of data to work with for covering quite a long time period. The original data from ILO are about 150,000 data points. If you include the additional imputations of at the price level, at the product price level using average CPI indices, and the evolution of the prices from the products that are available in the data, that shoots up to 450,000 about. And these are the data that I'm using. And this is the coverage in terms of global poverty and global affordability of a healthy diet that one can achieve. So that the above figure shows you the number of countries covered, and the sub-panel below shows you the share of global population that is covered. The dark blue shows the range of the share of global population that is being covered by price data, original and the imputed ones. The light blue has to do with expanding with a CPI index, and the gray area is being covered by interpolations on the level of the region or the level of the country, and interpolations. And the last bit from about 95% up until reaching the 100% coverage, this deals with the assumption is that poverty stays the same for the remaining of a global population. Well, in terms of levels and trends of the food component, I have traced here 6 countries in a twofold manner. The continuous line is the food component. The dotted line is the full poverty line. The difference between the two is the multiplier that I showed you before. When the line becomes straight, as for example, every line in the 19th century, every continuous line in the 19th century, is because there I'm assuming, let's say the purchasing power parity equivalence, which is that a purchasing power value for the United States in 1924 purchases the same goods back in 1820. That's quite a strong assumption, of course. And one can identify here basically the misalignment between the average CPI that is being used to transfer the values in 2011 PPPs with the change of the food component as derived from the ILO price data. For some countries, there is a downward trend. For other countries, there is an upward trend, like in Mexico. And for other countries, like in India, well, we are about at the same level throughout. Now, this figure shows you the affordability of a healthy diet over the long run on a global scale. And this is done in comparison, this is depicted in comparison with a poverty line of the $1.9 a day. There are a lot of details behind this, and I can gladly answer your questions in the Q&A. But the two lines trace each other quite closely, although in the beginning of the of the period, the estimates in terms of affordability of a global healthy diet are lower than that of the global poverty rate in terms of the dollar a day approach. And that changes from the second half of the 19th century and stays the same for almost the entire period that remains until 2018. The gap is substantial there. The estimate for global poverty in 2018 using the dollar a day approach is around 9%. And with the affordability of the food component, so of a poverty line, which we can think the 8 Lancet reference diet as being one, this poverty rate, or the global affordability rate, rises to about 16-17%. Now, when we apply the additional multipliers and we get, based on the 8 Lancet reference diet, a full-fledged poverty line, this is the picture one gets. The gap is substantially higher. All the way from 1820 until 2018, we see that the global poverty rate stands above the $1.9 a day. The gap is substantial also for the years after the 1980s, where we see the gap increasing. And in the latest years, this is so 31% is the 8 Lancet-based poverty line poverty rate compared to the 9.5 global poverty rate based on the $1.9 a day method. If we see the population count side of this estimate, then the gap is even larger. The dollar a day approach estimates around 700 million people being in poverty. In 2018, that's about 2.4 billion with 8 base poverty lines. This estimate, so the 8 base poverty lines are similar with the $5.5 a day estimates of coming from the World Bank, at least for the latest years. The gap is not that much for the earlier years in terms of population, but still, and also the percentage. But many more people fit within the gap in the years, especially after 1980. And here I try to, using a simple modeling that maybe we can talk more about this in the Q&A, about what the potential range of uncertainty is with respect to the cost of basic needs approach and the dollar a day. Last year, we did an exercise with a colleague estimating for 1990 and 2011, 2015, which are the reference year for the Millennium Development Goal, the first Millennium Development Goal, in terms of the uncertainty that is being applied by the cost of basic needs approach and the dollar a day approach. This showed that in the dollar a day, there is a lot of uncertainty because of the derivation method. Other ways of estimating a very similar line give you a much narrower gap. For example, the one suggested by Bob Allen, using a cost of basic needs background to estimate the dollar a day approach, to estimate a dollar a day value. On the other hand, a cost of basic needs approach has substantially narrower gap. This is done basically by modeling the 2 years, the estimates from the 2 years. Maybe I can quickly show you here. So here is a simple modeling. I'm assuming that if poverty is 100%, there's simply no uncertainty. And then I'm taking the points that have been estimated from our work last year using the cost of basic needs, or which is the red dots here, or the black dots that represent the dollar a day approach. And if you just apply this on the global, on the long run, this is the picture that you get, the one I showed you before. This is what one gets. So in terms of results, if one wants to, let's say, be at 95% certainty that no one who is potentially poor is left out of the counting, then one should use the top confidence interval of the 95% confidence interval. In that case, for 2018, that will be around 35%, and or 2.7 billion people living in poverty.
Mikhail,
So the
if you could
conclusion.
conclude.
Yeah. Well, I think I mentioned most of them already, so I'm going to skip to the further steps. I can share quickly 4 of them with you. First of all, there is a possibility of connecting the dots and avoid using average CPI indices with price data from the 19th century to at least for a number of countries, to be more precise about the work that is being done here. Also estimate the value of the Eat Lancet reference diet directly from the price data, and also include the uncertainties in this in its definitions. That is not, it was not part of the estimates that Hirvan and his colleagues did in 2019. Also directly estimate the uncertainty in global poverty statistic instead of doing this shortcut. And also, well, this is something that I didn't mention. It is part of the paper. There is a strong divergence between the CPI average rate and the food items based price index for China for the decade around 1990. And this, of course, it's pivotal in the global poverty results before 1995 or so. Well, I'll leave it here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Fascinating. Yes, thank you, Miguel. So there are no comments from the attendees. Panelists, you please do enter in the chat box if you'd like. Just remarkable archival work here from the ILO October data that was really remarkable from Miguel. We had looked into those data and thrown up our hands at the impossibility of doing what you did, Miguel. So it's very impressive actually to be able to track that over all that period of time, and really well complements Bob's work on the 18th century, which I had not known about at all. Nada commented about the importance of getting back to this uncertainty thing, which is very, very interesting. And Nada, of course, is leading the effort at the bank in the development data group in order to bring this into policy kind of operational terms. And that uncertainty interval will be quite important. So we'll come back to that at the end. But first, we can move to this next project. So from within the Food Prices for Nutrition work, we've been, as I mentioned, very much trying to update the nutrient requirements for an overall healthy diet. And Nada will speak to that in terms of the World Bank work. What we'll have now is our effort to dramatically increase the amount of price data being used for contemporary policy analysis. So Ash Venkat will share that, which I think is just an amazing story as well. Ash? That's great, thanks.
Great. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this session. My name is Aishwarya Venkat, and I'll be presenting on behalf of my co-author, Jess Wallingford, today. Both Jess and I are PhD students at the Friedman School and within the Food Prices for Nutrition team at Tufts University. And the research I will be presenting today is part of both of our doctoral dissertations. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and for more about our research group and our work, please feel free to visit the link if you're interested. To set up this paper, I'll start with the overarching motivation for our work, which is the question, how resilient are retail food prices? We asked this question specifically with respect to 2 types of shocks in this paper, the first of which is extreme weather events, and the second is the COVID-19 pandemic. The outcome of interest across both of these questions or shocks is retail food prices. So a lot of literature has focused on commodity price movements to measure inflation and consumer price indices and such. But we're more interested in using retail food prices as an indicator of food system performance at the consumer end of supply chains. Retail food prices provide a lot of information about real income and welfare effects at the local scale. And we know that retail food prices are particularly responsive to conflict, production shocks, anything that kind of unfolds at the local scale. It takes a while to trickle up. And we know that food price spikes are specifically very costly for poor people. So studying the global average effects of price responses to both of these shocks and provide us critical insights into net welfare impacts. We also partition our data set by food groups, and in doing so, we go beyond the historic emphasis on starchy staples and cereal grains. More nutritionally desirable foods, such as fruits and vegetables and animal source foods, are of course bulky and perishable, and trading these commodities incurs additional transportation and storage costs, all of which add to the consumer dollar share. And these costs are better reflected in the retail food price more so than the commodity price, which we're kind of used to studying. So both shocks that we study here can have ambiguous effects. So lower demand for certain foods may be driven by lower incomes or switching to non-perishables for consumption at home. Lower supply for certain foods due to labor constraints or limited wholesale supplies could also be causing higher prices. Our analysis is purely empirical, and we test for the net effect of both of these forces affecting retail food prices. And we can do that because we have a fairly large data set of about 1.3 million price observations derived from early warning data, early warning systems. And I'll explain the data set a little bit. So most audience members might be familiar with the commodity price indices that's shown in this graph. This measure of interest here is the FAO Food Price Index, which is this dark blue line. This is the average of food group price indices weighted by export shares, and we can see trends for all of those here. We see that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the FAO Food Price Index falls due to lower demand for food. And we know that this was driven by lower incomes as well as increased cost of retailing, particularly during early 2020 when there was a lot of uncertainty about the pandemic. Since then, since May 2020, the FFPI has since been on an increasing upward trend. And we think that appears to be driven by the price indices for oils and sugar specifically. By far, the largest effect of COVID-19 has been on income. So a lot of literature has focused on income losses during the pandemic. We know that countries quickly mobilized existing social safety net programs to limit sudden increases in poverty due to lockdown measures. And we can readily study the impacts of different policy responses to COVID-19. So the figure on the left derives from a recent paper by David Laborde and Herforth and colleagues on the poverty impacts of COVID-19. And they estimate this based on the fraction of people who cannot afford a healthy diet. This paper estimates excess poverty caused by the pandemic by comparing observed poverty to a counterfactual world where there was no pandemic. So the way to read this graph is by comparing the gray line here to the other bars. So this paper finds that an extra 141 million people could not afford a healthy diet in 2020 of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a fairly large number. Depending on scenarios, there's some difference, but the effect is still large. And in parallel with the income line of work, there are several papers now that are looking at retail food prices and supply chain disruptions. And there's obviously a lot of global interest in both of those. In the climate and food security literature, there's been a lot of attention going towards climate shocks, specifically on food production. So this figure is from a recent scoping review by Davis et al., which documented how frequently environmental disruptions are studied at various points in the food supply chain. They found that production shocks are by far the most frequently studied environmental disruption, but storage and processing, retail and markets, every other part of the supply chain is not received nearly enough attention. And even within production shocks, we find that there's a lot of emphasis specifically on staple grains and cereals, on the top 3 cereal crops specifically, so maize, rice, and wheat. We see very little research on climate shocks to nutritionally sensitive food groups, such as fruits and vegetables and animal source foods. And looking at the variety of different extreme weather events that tend to be studied, extreme precipitation and temperatures are pretty well studied, but other shocks such as storms and trends in climate phenomenon and oscillations remain less frequently studied. So this supply and demand diagram illustrates the price dynamics at play here. The magnitude and direction of each retail price change, of course, depends on the disruption, where in the supply chain it occurs, and how it propagates throughout a supply chain, or even in a region. The first panel illustrates a price rise because of both higher supply costs and higher demand. The second panel here illustrates a price rise when there's higher supply costs, which outweigh demand reduction. And the last panel here illustrates a price reduction if lower demand offsets higher supply costs. And we recognize that all these dynamics are occurring in different markets, market to market, item to item, and so on. But again, both of our analyses focus on the net effect of each shock and how it impacts retail food prices. So I'll start by describing our data set, which is very rich. We derived this retail food price data set by combining monthly retail price observations from 3 different sources. The first source is the FAO's Global Information and Early Warning System, or GEWS. The second data source is the USAID's Famine Early Warning Systems Network, or FuseNet. And the third is the World Food Programme's Vulnerability Analysis and Mapping System, or VAM. So all 3 of those together give us over 1 million observations. And we use a subset of these spanning 2000 to 2021 to study the climate shocks. So this total sample is about 1.3 million prices from around 2,300 markets in 71 countries, which is a very, very rich data set. A map of these market locations is shown on the top right here. As you can see, there is a lot of emphasis on food price monitoring in low and middle income countries, particularly in Africa and Asia. Most of the observations derived from GEWS and VAM. However, FUSE is present in some sub-Saharan African countries, as well as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The figure on the bottom left here shows the number of price observations that we have for each month in the data set. You can see that the WFP VAM comprises a vast majority of our data set, about 85%, while GEWS and FUSE contribute about 7% each. We also see that food price monitoring in the VAM data set improved greatly after 2010. So we averaged over 8,000 observations starting in 2010 or so. The figure on the right here provides a time series of average global retail prices in 2017 USD per 1,000 kilocalories. So all of these have been, excuse me, all price observations here have been converted from local currency units to 2017 USD using CPI and PPP information. And all food items have been matched to food composition tables to derive calorie information as well. So this is the standardized metric combining both of these pieces of information. The column on the left presents non-perishable food groups, and the column on the right provides perishable food groups. Note that the axes are different for each sub-panel. So breads and cereals here are by far the cheapest food group, whereas meats and fish and seafood tend to be the most expensive. And I don't think you can read the labels here, but I will point out still that the distribution of markets tracking different food groups is very uneven. So breads and cereals are observed practically everywhere, but meat prices, for example, are only observed in 11 countries, or 2% of the markets in our data set. All prices, we see a consistent positive slope across all groups, but you will notice several spikes, most frequently in the FUSE data set, which we think are artifactual anomalies. We know are artifactual anomalies due to poorly measured inflation, primarily in Zimbabwe. And you can also see briefly, you can see a spike in the price of breads and cereals during the 2008 to 2010 global food price crisis, shows up as a little blip here. So to study COVID-19 shocks, we zoom into a study period of 2020 to 2021. The graph on the left here shows average global food prices for each food group during this study period. The sample size for this analysis is much smaller, so about 73,000 observations, about 400 markets in 36 countries. And this subset is because a lot of the price information had to be matched to both policy stringency and stay-at-home behavior data, which I'll discuss in a minute. We see that prices for most food groups increased steadily in November to December of 2020, and they fall towards the end in March of 2021, which is the end of the study period. But the exception to this trend is fruits and vegetables, for which average global retail food price declined in March to September of 2010 and increased a little bit towards the end. Going back to the climate analysis, we studied 5 different types of contemporaneous climate shocks. We looked at floods, droughts, storms, heat waves, and cold waves. And each of these discretized shock, no shock kind of metrics are derived from gridded climate data or spatial data. So all extreme events were spatially matched to the market and month of price observation based on each market's GPS coordinates. Each measure is also defined a little differently. So we define flood and drought based on the 1-month standard precipitation and evapotranspiration index. We use monthly minimum and maximum temperature anomalies from the TerraClimate data set to study heat waves and cold waves. And finally, for storms, we use NOAA's International Best Track Archive for Climate Stewardship, or the IBTRACS database, to identify any storm that fell within a 200 kilometer radius of a market. And we define a storm as occurring if at least a Category 2 storm was observed in that radius. So the graph on the right shows the distribution of each of these hazards throughout the study period. You can see that heat waves are by far the most commonly observed shock in our data set. About 12% of all market months were experienced a heat wave. All other hazards occur less than 3% of market months, but this comparison isn't really meaningful because we know that these climate hazards are concentrated in space. So we know that storms tend to occur around the equator, so you would expect markets in that equator to experience more storms. So the number of markets and countries where each hazard is found is also described in this tiny label here. Again, each hazard is location specific, so the number of occurrences in market observations varies greatly. I want to emphasize here that this analysis is a work in progress, and we chose to discretize shocks kind of as a first pass at this very large data set. We didn't want to assume any functional forms about magnitude and severity. So we're starting very simple here, and I'd be very curious for your feedback about how we can improve modeling of climate shocks. Going back to our analysis of COVID-19 impacts, we chose to look at 2 indicators. First is policy stringency, and the second is residential mobility. So starting with policy stringency, you'll see on the graph on your left that the global average policy stringency index is measured using the Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker. So this is a summary measure that looks at 7 different indicators related to school and workplace closures, canceled public events, gathering restrictions, public transport closures, and then movement restrictions. So this is just a summary measure of all of those policies enacted. And we see from this graph that policy stringency peaked around April 2020 and has since been on a downward trend with some exceptions during April of 2021. Another measure of mobility that we looked at that has been released more recently is the Google mobility data, or Google COVID-19 mobility, community mobility reports. This data set uses aggregate data from Android smartphone users who have their location history turned on. So all metrics compare movements to a relative baseline from January 5th to February 6, 2020. So you'll see from this graph that movements in residential areas, which is the blue line here, peaked in April and May 2020. And we see a continued increased mobility to all other destinations kind of since then. So people decided to stay at home, didn't go anywhere else. But after lockdowns and things started easing up, more and more people traveled to a variety of different locations. One exception to this was over the holidays in 2020. So more and more people gather during this time. So to define stay-at-home behavior or adherence, really, we use the residential Google Mobility Index to define stay-at-home behavior in the rest of our work. we also link retail food prices to stay-at-home behavior, policy stringency from the previous slide, as well as COVID-19 cases and deaths. So this graph shows the evolution of the stay-at-home behavior. So putting these two in the same graph, you can see they kind of follow policy stringency, and stay-at-home behavior kind of follows, kind of tracks each other in time. Yeah, we observed that stay-at-home behavior roughly follows this trend, and both, peak in April 2020. We see that new COVID-19 cases, however, increased steadily during the study period. And you can't see this very well, but the real dark gray bars here represent COVID-19 mortality, which increased shortly after December 2020. So we did a lot of processing steps to standardize our food price observations. For the climate shock work, we compile the data, adjust for inflation, convert to 2017 USD using purchasing power parity, and then match each food item to either the USDA standard reference or the West Africa food composition table to derive the final metric of 2017 USD per 1,000 kilocalories. For the COVID shocks work, we normalized all item prices to a baseline period of January 2020. We transformed this data from local currency to unit list price levels. And then we normalized each of these, we first differenced each of these price levels to obtain a month-to-month percentage point change in price level. And the regression specifications for both analyses look very similar. We run a difference in difference specification using OLS regression with fixed effects. And the coefficient of interest here is beta 3, which represents the average effect of each type of shock on each price outcome. The outcome of interest for climate shocks, again, is price level in standardized units of 2017 USD per 1,000 kilocalories, whereas for COVID shocks, the outcome is percentage point change. And due to the spatial scales of each of these analyses, we also use different fixed effects. So for climate shocks, the fixed effects we chose to include are market location, market month, and market year. Whereas for COVID shocks, because the data is more aggregated, we included market location, region month, and region year. So it's a little bit more lower spatial resolution compared to the climate work. And now for some results. The key takeaway from the climate shock analysis is that the impacts are very heterogeneous across food groups. So we see a lot of statistical significance, but the magnitudes are often very small, indicating that retail food prices are actually pretty resilient to climate shocks where they're observed. So we can parse this by food group. We see that cold waves are associated with the greatest magnitude of increase in price of breads and cereals, which is fairly surprising. Cold waves seem to have a disproportionately large effect compared to the other shocks that we've studied here. Pulses, nuts, and seeds seem fairly stable, except for storm events, in which case the average price of this food group decreases by quite a bit. And perhaps one of the more surprising results here is that the price of fruits and vegetables is very stable, but increases significantly during the storm. And again, this is definitely a work in progress, and we invite your feedback on this, on better ways to present a lot of heterogeneity in more meaningful ways. For the stay-at-home behavior analysis, we find that more time spent at home or lower mobility is associated with price rise, whereas price rises are observed for non-perishable food groups, whereas the opposite is true for the perishable food groups. We see a decline in price of fruits and vegetables, meats, fish, and seafood. Most notably, the sugar and confectionery group shows a particularly strong positive association between stay-at-home behavior and price level change. For the policy stringency indicator, we find an increase in policy stringency is associated with a decrease in price level, but this association is fairly weak. And the opposite direction of effect between these two indicators tells us that they might proxy different sets of impacts from the pandemic on food systems. So sorry, I'll wrap up here. In conclusion, we see that retail food prices are actually pretty resilient. The magnitudes that we observe are, with some exceptions, fairly small, which tells us it takes a lot to affect the retail food price of different food items. Results from climate work are heterogeneous, but there's a more clear pattern to results on the COVID front. We see higher prices for sugar and confectionery food groups, indicating higher demand, limited supply for sugary foods during the pandemic. We also conclude that policy stringency and stay-at-home behavior likely measured different dimensions of COVID-19 impacts on the food system. Of course, there are a lot of limitations, and there are a lot of more refined econometrics that we would like to do next. But I'll end here and say thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful, thank you, Ash. Can folks hear me actually? Good, because my computer just had a meltdown, so I've just switched to my phone. Sorry about that. So if there are questions, you feel free to enter them in the Q&A. But we could go straight, I think, in the interest of time, to Nada Hamadeh to describe how this will go forward, this agenda on food prices for nutrition. Again, you can follow the project, with the hashtag food prices for nutrition, or just Google the term food prices for nutrition. But Nada, can you tell us what you're doing in terms of defining healthy diets
Sure.
and monitoring with the data that you have?
Thank you so much, Will, and thank you for everyone for joining this event. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and while I am doing that, I just want to say again that this is the latest research from the Food Prices for Nutrition project. And this is a project that is a partnership between Tufts, IFPRI, and the World Bank, and it's funded by Gates and UK8. And I just want to as well recognize that Will Masters and Anna Herforth, who are here in this session, are the intellectual leadership actually behind all of this work. So today we'll talk a little bit about what we are doing with using the International Comparison Program data to calculate the cost of a healthy diet, but also what we are looking as well at in terms of looking at alternative sources of price data, specifically the consumer price index data from a couple of countries, and trying to compare the results that will come out from both exercises. I'll start with an introduction, move to methods and data sets, go through the results with you, and then with some conclusions, ideas, and next steps. So in terms of introduction, the Food Prices for Nutrition project has transformed the analysis on diet costs and affordability. And to date, it has been using the very rich global food price data set from the International Comparison Program. And for those of you who don't know much about the International Comparison Program, it is one of the largest statistical exercises in the world, and it collects retail prices for comparable and standardized food and beverage items across 170 countries. So the Food Prices for Nutrition project used this data to measure the minimum daily cost of diets meeting health standards and breakdown of diet costs by food groups. It also provides affordability indicators comparing the diet costs with the international poverty line and national food expenditures to estimate the number of people who cannot afford food to meet dietary needs. So why are these indicators important? If you have seen the latest State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, the SOFI report, in 2020, they first reported the cost and affordability of healthy diet as new food security indicators. And the high cost of healthy diet and persistently high level of poverty and income inequality keep healthy diets out of reach for around 3 billion people in the world. And the cost of a healthy diet here is calculated based on food-based dietary guidelines. So what is the research question we're looking at in this study? As I said, the Food Prices for Nutrition project has estimated to date the cost of a healthy diet using the ICP 2017 data. But these global data sets, although they are very comprehensive and they have a great coverage, they also have some limitations. So these data sets are collected by national statistical offices for the purpose of the International Comparison Program, and we have data for 170 countries. However, the item selection is not necessarily highly representative of local consumption behavior. Because for the ICP, we balance the cross-country comparability of the items and the national representativeness. So likely some low-cost, highly representative items might be missed. For example, green leafy vegetables that are locally specific and tend to be very cheap. You're not going to find those on the ICP list. The ICP as well provides you with national data, national average prices. So you have a lack of subnational data sets that will prevent you from conducting subnational analysis, which might be much more important from a policy point of view and very effective. The ICP provides one estimate every 4 to 5 years. So if we're looking at frequent tracking of the cost of a healthy diet over time, we will face this if you want to draw back. So the research question we're asking ourselves is, what would be the cost of a healthy diet if we were to use instead national price data sets from the Consumer Price Index, the CPI? And in this study, we explore using the comprehensive CPI data sets for the cost of healthy diet estimation in some selected countries. I want to say here that the CPI data sets naturally are more representative of the local consumption in countries, but that doesn't mean that they don't have as well some limitations. As you'll see through the slides that I'm going to present, in some cases, specifically in countries where national statistical systems are not that strong, you'll see that the CPI data sets do not have the same rigorous quality assurance that the ICP data set has. As we know as well, and I think for all of us who have tried to get access to a large data set of Consumer Price Index price data, that some countries are more amenable to sharing their data, and they do not have very limitations on data access. And we know that there are countries who are completely against providing access to their underlying price data. So that is something that we would have to deal with as we try to do this analysis in more and more countries. The CPI as well provides you limited metadata on item specifications, so item quality, for example, in some cases, even the quantity that is being surveyed. All right. In terms of the methods and the data sets, so the cost of a healthy diet is measured as the cost of the least expensive locally available foods to meet requirements for energy and food-based dietary guidelines. We're following here in this study the healthy diet basket method. So it's a diet pattern that comprises of the median amounts for each food group across 10 national food-based dietary guidelines. That sums to a total of 2,329 calories. And you can see in this table the food groups and the number of items in each food group. In terms of country coverage, we selected 5 middle-income countries in different geographical regions. So we have 2 countries that are upper middle-income countries. These are South Africa and Mexico, and 3 that are lower middle-income countries, Vietnam, Philippines, and Nigeria. We're trying to detect both temporal and subnational variations, which if we were to use, ICP data, we would not be able to do that because we do not have subnational data from ICP nor temporal data across months. And we're also comparing the resulting cost of a healthy diet with this CPI data set with the cost based on the ICP 2017 global price data. Today, we're presenting preliminary results. So we're still fine-tuning these results for Mexico, Vietnam, and Nigeria, and the final results will be in our upcoming paper. Okay. So these are the data sets that we had access to and that we are using. In Mexico, monthly average price from 46 cities, and we ended up using 79 items. In Vietnam, monthly average prices from 25 provinces, and we ended up using 107 items from the CPI list in Vietnam. In Nigeria, 37 states in 2017, these are urban prices, and for 137 items. And these are items, starchy staples, legumes, nuts and seeds, foods from animals, etc., as you can see in the legend. These are some of our preliminary findings. So if you were to look at Mexico, the cost of a healthy diet, there is a temporal trend. The data in Mexico show clear seasonality trend with highest median cost of a healthy diet being observed in November. and then the lowest median cost in February. Although we are seeking the least cost diet in each month and location, the food selection doesn't change much over time in Mexico, and that is why we see this clear seasonality pattern. Subnational variations show that Tijuana, which is on the US border, has the highest average cost. Iguala is in the middle of Mexico. It has the lowest average cost. And the cost of healthy diet using 2017 CPI data is about 10% higher than the average cost. The 2017 ICP data is about 10% higher than the average cost using monthly subnational CPI data. So as you can see, the diet cost using the ICP 2017 data is $3.08 US, while the average cost by CPI data is $2.79 US. So why is that the case? If we were to dig deeper into the food selection, so the left panel shows how many times a food is selected in the least cost diet in all locations month. The cost allocation, which is the right panel, indicates the average contribution of food item in the least cost diet among all locations months. In Mexico, most of food items constructing the least cost healthy diets are also included in the ICP data. Some exceptions include chayote, green tomato, and corn tortilla. Another observation is that there are only 37 foods selected in the least cost diets over time and over subnational regions in 2017. And that is different than the other countries, as I will show in the next slides. So if we're to go to Vietnam and to look at the cost of a healthy diet, data in Vietnam show a stable cost over time, with highest median cost in April of $2.62 US and the lower median cost in September, and that is $2.51 US. This stability might be due to two reasons. Either the food prices in Vietnam are less seasonal, or the least cost model, it selects different food items in different months, which reduce the seasonality pattern. However, subnational variation in Vietnam is substantial. The capital city has the highest average cost, and Hung Yen, which is a northern province, has the lowest average cost. The cost of a healthy diet using 2017 ICP data is about 40% higher than the average cost using monthly subnational CPI data. And in later slides, we'll discuss a little bit more the sources of these differences. Where do they come from? In terms of food selection in Vietnam, several locally nutritious, available nutritious food contribute significantly to the least cost healthy diets, such as mustard green, mung bean sprouts, and rice vermicelli, which were not surveyed in the 2017 ICP food price data. So that could be one source of this difference. Another observation is that there are only 31 foods selected in the least cost diets over time over subnational regions in 2017. Okay, looking at Nigeria, which I think poses the biggest questions and problems among all the data sets that we have worked with. So the data in Nigeria shows a moderate temporal variation with the highest median cost in February and the lowest median cost in May. However, the values in May and January are very inconsistent with the values in other months, which raises data quality concerns in Nigeria with their CPI data. Subnational variations shows that Anambra State has the highest average cost. So it's not the capital Abuja nor the largest city Lagos. It's this state Anambra, which has a lot of untold oil. While Usun State shows the lowest cost of $1.45 US. And the large standard deviations here as well raise concerns about data quality. So the cost of a healthy diet using 2017 ICP data is twice the average cost using monthly subnational CPI data. And if we were to look at the food selection, in Nigeria, many locally available nutritious vegetable items contribute to the cost of healthy diets. So these include, again, local dark green leafy vegetables such as igbo, water leaf, green leaf, tete, and bitter leaf. And coconut and date, palm fruit, as well helped lower the diet cost. Food selection is very diverse in Nigeria. There are in total 80 items versus 37 in Mexico, 31 in Vietnam, that were selected in the least cost diet across all 37 states and over 12 months in 2017. So some conclusions, observations, and next steps on what we are trying to do here. So the cost of a healthy diet using monthly subnational CPI presents potential differences to the results using the global ICP dataset. And some of the sources of these differences could be, first, item selection. So as you've seen in the slides before, locally available nutritious foods that are not usually found in the ICP global item list may help reduce diet costs substantially. Also, there's a difference in item quality. In ICP, we try to price standardized items across countries, items of standardized quality. While here, when we are looking at the CPI data sets, we're not really focusing on ensuring comparability of quality between countries, naturally. A survey frame, so differences can also be due to survey frame between ICP and CPI and outlet selection differences. One of the biggest points that I want to make here that we're still investigating as well is on the averaging method. So the ICP produces what we call a national annual average, which is essentially weighted. The observations are weighted to create a national annual average. While here we are still using simple average of monthly subnational CPI data. And that's something we're going to try to fine tune and refine in our experimentations. In terms of quality assurance, as you've seen, differences are more pronounced in certain countries than others. ICP has robust quality assurance validation protocols that happen at 3 levels, first at the country level, then by regional agencies that is coordinating the program in that region, and finally at the global level at the World Bank. While here in some countries, they may not have the capacity to have these very rigorous data quality assurance, specifically the countries that have weaker statistical systems. So different countries may present different magnitudes and patterns of variation, food substitutions over time, and different food selections across subnational locations affect these variations. And to precisely measure and track the cost of a healthy diet, we believe that it might be useful to rely on national CPI food price data because it provides more locally available nutritious food items. It provides monthly and subnational data and annual data as well. However, the quality assurance and data validation are extremely important for global monitoring program. So if we were to adopt an exercise whereby we collect CPI data and we try to calculate the cost of a healthy diet based on that, we need to do more quality assurance and validation at our stage before adopting this data into our calculations. And as I said before, CPI data access may pose challenges in certain countries. So whereby we may be able to get CPI data for many countries, we will still have countries that will say no, and we will need to use data from other sources for these countries. So I'd like to think that a natural extension of our food prices for nutrition project would be to start an exercise where we collect national CPI food price data from the countries. These are data that have already been collected, that are readily available, where some quality assurance have already been undertaken by the countries. And then we should do more data quality assurance validations at our level, just like the way we do in the international comparison program in the ICP. And then we can calculate the cost and affordability indicator based on that data sets. In terms of the immediate next steps with regards to this study, we have also obtained the data from Philippines and South Africa, which we will incorporate. We will try to better understand the sources of differences between the results from ICP datasets and the results from the CPI datasets. And then we're also going to try to attempt to calculate the cost of a healthy diet in the 5 countries using the Sentinel food approach. So while the healthy diet basket approach, which we have been using to date, requires 11 food items in the basket, the Sentinel food approach recommends monitoring prices of double the number of food necessary, or approximately 22 items, to ensure at least each item has a substitute. The Sentinel foods selected for each country should be among the most affordable items for each food group, widely available, culturally important, and commonly consumed in that country. And we believe that it is considered, this approach will be considered a more feasible, efficient approach for global diet diet cost calculations and monitoring programs in the future. So I will stop here and happy to respond to any questions or provide additional information. My co-authors as well are attending, and they're all happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much. Thanks, Will.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's a great study. This is actually the first of these validation exercises that we've had a chance. And Mikhail asks a really good question in our chat just now, saying, can you just characterize overall whether the main driver of differences is item selection, right? Picking up these local foods that weren't globally standardized or regionally standardized list, or is it price levels and data collection quality for the standard item? Do you have a sense of that already? Because you didn't provide a clear breakdown of it, but perhaps you already have a sense of it.
I think we started to look at the first aspect. So in some of the slides, I've shown that the selection, the item selection are making a difference. And definitely we know that the CPI item list has these more locally available products that are important for nutrition, while the ICP list might not have those items. But also, I think the averaging method is something we need to look clearly at, because in the ICP, we're producing a national annual average. So we are weighing observations. So we will try to see if it's possible to do some weighting schemes here, even if we were to use, for example, population as weights of these different subnational areas. And we will have more and more of these results to be included in our paper. But indeed, those two aspects, I think, are the biggest probably in explaining the differences between the ICP data sets and the CPI results.
Fascinating, yeah, and a third kind of difference is type of outlet.
Yes, that's true.
So, in the United States, one could typically acquire a nutrient adequate diet or healthy diet at zero cost, because there's enough food pantries, kitchens and so forth, that if people know homeless, people, unhoused people and so forth, they know where to go. You can acquire at essentially zero cost a lot of food in the United States. But that's not what we're asking about, right? And so similarly in Nigeria, I could imagine that if you go at the very end of the day to the very lowest cost markets and you're willing to take whatever they have, like you might, so whether these enumerators are going to the low cost, more popular markets where there'll be less sanitation, less services and so forth, or are they going to markets that have more retail services would be a really interesting question.
Yeah, and I think to add to your point, one thing that we have as well observed in the international comparison program is the timing of the day when you go to these open markets to get the items. So fish, for example, the price of fish fluctuates throughout the day. And at the end of the day, you're going to get the lower cost, the lower prices, if you want.
And also lower quality.
Indeed, yes, and lower quality, indeed. So exactly, and a lot of interesting questions that we still have to examine within this study. But I'm wondering if Anna wants to say a few words more, or Jan, they are here.
Anna, do you want to say something?
Sure. I think you had your hand up, so go ahead, and then I'll add on to your point.
Okay, no problem. So I think 2 points to make here. So the first thing is although we haven't been this is preliminary analysis, we haven't been quantified, all the sources. But my gut feeling is definitely more, about the locally available food, because I just want to highlight that because we're using the least cost method. So the inclusion or exclusion of food items can be very important to the results. So this is the first kind of gut feeling. And the second one is that I also have to say that country by country, the sources could be totally different. So this is why we are doing this kind of case study analysis approach, right? So, and also if you look at the OECD Mexico, data set, I assume the data quality should be totally, can be different from the data from Nigeria. So just 2 points to make.
Yeah, really excellent points. And I guess I want to bring back the overall point that we're sort of looking at the margins of this estimates. You know, when we're looking at the cost of a healthy diet, we do see differences, as we would expect to see differences depending on the data set that we look at. But the differences don't really change the conclusions. Like when we are looking at the cost of healthy diet, we're still seeing, no matter what data we use, that it's going to be unaffordable for a lot of people. And speaking of Nigeria specifically, there are several actors in different parts of the government of Nigeria who are very engaged and interested in using their own national statistics for this purpose, and looking at the, you know, where and when people can't afford a healthy diet across the country, and then having that in the policy discussions in agriculture and other, you know, ministries that are engaged in the food system. So it's really interesting to look at what are the sources of these differences and what are the best data to use, especially as we're thinking about setting up a global tracking system to, you know, monitor the cost of healthy diet more frequently than every 4 or 5 years. But when it comes to engaging policymakers in these conversations, I guess I would just emphasize again, it's really important that countries are using their own data systems that they already have set up to draw these conclusions around lack of affordability for many people of healthy diets.
Yeah, indeed. And if I may add as well that, you know, policymakers will be interested to see these subnational findings that we are presenting, which we were not able to do with an ICP data sets that provides a national annual average, basically. But there was a question from, I think, Mikael on basically how many countries we can get data for. And I'm going to say I was surprised, because when we went to Philippines, they gave us the data immediately, to Vietnam, to, there are a lot of countries who are willing to share their data, but there are countries we know that are not going to allow us to get their data. And we know that some countries will ask us to basically go to the country and to work on their servers, basically, but they will not give us, I think, the data to host ourselves. But still, nevertheless, I think we should try to get data from as many countries as we can, because I think that would be very useful.
Can I ask a question about this? So I think that getting all these locally specific kinds of foods is really great. I think this is really essential to fine tune all this sort of exercise to the food availability. But then you get this problem about how you have a uniform standard to compare across countries, right? So this depends on how you define a healthy diet and what its operational implications are. I mean, it has to be an operationally useful definition. But so I just, I think that I've tried using linear programming to do this. And you have uniform nutritional characteristics. I wondered, it didn't sound like that's what you were doing. So I just wondered what you were doing. If you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Very important, yes. And we could speak actually first about how we've updated the nutrient requirements. So there's a whole bunch of papers in the project about state-of-the-art nutrient requirements, which turn out to have evolved a lot in recent years. But then there's moving from essential nutrients, vitamins, minerals, and macronutrients to phytochemicals and many other things that are in food groups. So, you know, contemporary dietary guidelines define health in terms of food groups. And the reason for that is because there's lots of health attributes other than nutrients that matter for health production. So, Anna, do you want to say a little bit about how you constructed the Healthy Diet Basket?
Yeah, that's a great question. And indeed, it's important that we have the same standard so that we're not comparing, you know, different countries have different national dietary guidelines. Yeah. And we don't use different standards for each country, we use the same standard. So the way that we've done that is to take the average across many different dietary guidelines. And that is what Nada mentioned as the healthy diet basket method. It's essentially the median amounts recommended of each food group across countries. And it works quite well, even when you look at countries that have dietary guidelines which aren't quantified. The relative proportions of each food group all look pretty similar to the proportions that come out from looking at the median amounts recommended across each country. And another thing that we found in other papers in the pipeline in the Food Prices for Nutrition project is that even though we use dietary guidelines as a standard instead of nutrient requirements, dietary guidelines are supposed to meet nutrient requirements. That's how they were formulated. Each country, comes up with a diet pattern which would generally meet micronutrient and macronutrient requirements. And we find that that's true. So even when we select the least cost items, we end up finding that on average, meeting dietary guidelines meets about 94% of all nutrient requirements. And it jumps around a little bit, as you would expect, because every day you eat different food items in the same food groups. And so you get different nutrients each day. But in general, we find that the standard does end up meeting nutrient requirements as well as proportionality for, generally culturally acceptable diets and diets that protect against chronic disease.
We also have an element, an effort to think about the items within the food groups being culturally appropriate and adapted, right? So in the least cost diet, the instance of the item in each food group, or the instance of each item bringing each nutrient, if it's a nutrient adequate diet, would of course just be the lowest cost one. And that, might or might not be a combination that fits a culinary pattern and a tradition. So that, we have papers in econ about, preferences being quite sticky, as people are not necessarily willing to move to the lowest cost item, even though it's conceivable to make a dish that is a mix of items that are not usually consumed together. That would be not culturally appropriate. So we do have a way of thinking about food preferences that would align with dietary guidelines. And of course, that adds significant cost. So as we think about this continuum of diet quality metrics from the health production function perspective that are increasingly consistent with an overall achievement of your genetic potential for height and weight, and then achievement of your genetic potential for longevity, we're getting to that in ways that are more or less respectful of people's revealed preferences. What we're finding, is quite interesting in the sense that the least cost sources of nutrients and the least cost sources of the food groups as defined by dietary guidelines are not unimaginable meals. Mm-hmm. It's no longer true that, as you, Bob, found in the 1770s case for England, it's not a crazy diet. Like there's something about foodways, there's something about traditions that does pick up these attributes of foods that no one can taste, smell, or see, that people don't know exist. And we've done surveys of dietary knowledge in which it's clear that people have no idea what's in food. We've interviewed people at the exits of restaurants and they have no idea what they ate in the United States today. And you interview people in my case, a study in Malawi, people have no idea what's in food. They think that an orange Fanta has the same things as an orange. A physical orange is the same as an orange Fanta, because why wouldn't it be? How would they know? And yet foodways do seem to map to some degree to these needs. And of course, people then don't actually demand those foods necessarily because they care about things other than health, and also displace healthy foods by unhealthy foods.
Yeah, so I've been trying to figure out some of these food preferences by cooking all the linear programming diets and eating them to see how they fared in terms of palatability. And so it's very interesting what that reveals, actually. But I'm sure we have other things to.
George Dantzig, so the inventor of the simplex method, I don't
Yes.
know if you read the memoir that he wrote about this, in which he, of course, in those days, he asked his wife, right? He just went home and told her what the meals were. And he has very funny bits in his memoir about the errors that he made in the nutrient composition, particularly regarding vinegar. So he had sort of misunderstood the nutrient composition of vinegar and asked her to cook this thing with a huge amount of vinegar because of an error. But then when in fact he got it right, it was not crazy.
Yeah.
I expect that's what you found as well. It's not an unimaginable meal.
Well, what I discovered was, for instance, Angus Deaton kept telling me that Indians didn't like to eat sorghum, even though it came out as a least cost food. So I cook sorghum, and I think it tastes really good. I don't think there's a taste issue, but there's two problems with sorghum. One is that it takes, like you can boil sorghum grains like rice, but it takes over an hour to get them soft enough to eat. So that is a huge fuel cost, right? That makes it undesirable. The other thing is, even when you do that, they're still very kind of crunchy. So if you had bad teeth, it would be really hard to eat that. Whereas rice is really easy to eat if you've got bad teeth. So I think that, that's a reason that a lot of people in poor countries have bad teeth, right? So that's one reason they wouldn't want to eat it. So I think a lot of stuff actually makes sense if you do it. So anyhow, I believe in eating all these foods.
No, it's fascinating. Yeah, and there's also issues of food composition and anti-nutrients, right? So sorghum, brown sorghum would have tannins, and so some of our project sort of is thinking a little bit about the anti-nutrients and the bioavailability and absorption, although that's a very challenging thing. So there are people in the attendees and so forth who I'm sure have worked a fair bit in this. I see Lisa Mancino, who leads the markets division of Economics Research Service at USDA. Lisa, if you're on, if you have thoughts, you could type in the Q&A, or I can unmute you if you like, about these kinds of least cost diets, which are closely related, not exactly the same thing as the Thrifty Food Plan in the United States. And the Thrifty Food Plan is used to show Americans and to show legislators that the level of SNAP benefits, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits, is not a crazy idea, that you can acquire foods. They may be quite time consuming to prepare, not as time consuming as sorghum, but still pretty time consuming to prepare. They may have other problems, but the Thrifty Food Plan that's used by USDA does show that SNAP benefits are adequate to acquire a healthy diet in the United States, and that's been revised, and a lot of interesting work on that. I don't recognize other names of people, others on the call who might have thoughts, but keen to hear from Mikhail if you have anything else as you looked across countries, through the early 20th century, that great data from the 20s. The industrialization of the food system has totally changed the landscape of what's in a grocery store, but doesn't look like it's changed the least cost items all that much. Is that really true?
Well, of course, I haven't looked at every result of every country throughout all these years that the calculations have been done. However, I do see that the solutions are more or less stable. So there are years that there are changes, but the solutions overall remain for, let's say, bursts of 20, 30 years or a bit less than that. And when they change it, they might change for a couple of years because of some price structure change, but then they revert back. So I think they kind of converge to a level or to a configuration that is perhaps geographically predefined, or well, it is specific to a country for sure, because I'm doing that only on a country level. But may I ask a question again about the last paper presented? So I would be curious if the intention is also to go to the affordability of the baskets in the end, and if that is the case, are you going to have a look also in the subnational level with the amazing data that exists in the World Bank in terms of distributional information.
Nada, do you want to comment on that? And then Anna had a question as well.
I think we need to find the data first. I think to be able to do that at that level of subnational detail, we will need to examine what data is available on incomes, subnational incomes, and food expenditures. But yes, we can definitely examine the possibility of doing that.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's where some of the initiatives at national level are going with it. So in Nigeria, what they are looking to do is use the monitoring data of the Nigeria Bureau of Statistics, but the food expenditures and income data from household expenditure surveys, so that they would be able to look at affordability with their own data, but from two different sources, one that's for monitoring and one that's not. That was, yeah, there's, I think, a lot more work to be done in terms of the affordability side. But I actually had a question for you, Mikhail, because looking back in history, just to clarify, is what you did to take the cost, so you used Eat Lancet as a standard for Healthy Diet. You could use Healthy Diet Basket. They're very, very similar in cost. So you took the cost and then looked at food, the food CPI over time to estimate the cost. Is that it? And I wanted to ask, the question was, when you talked about the possibility of using price data directly to calculate the diet, it's, to our knowledge, that probably is not possible, because it's very hard to get item price data from countries even now, let alone historically. It's not reported to the IMF right now, or as far as I know, in the October inquiries, it's not available. So I wondered what you meant about trying to calculate it directly.
Yes. Okay. So the thing is to, first of all, what I did, this work in this paper is, well, exploits work done in another paper. And so I'm using basically the food component I estimated there as a price index to move the 2011 estimates for the Eat Lancet Healthy Diet done by Hirvan and colleagues. So I have used a very simple, so basically the CPF definition of the food component by Bob in his AER paper from 2017, which I estimated for as many countries as possible and as many years as possible in this period, and I'm using that as a price index to move the value backwards and forwards in time of the one estimated to 2011. But I'm not estimating its value from, let's say, well, from bottom up at any point. Okay. Of course, ideally, you would like to actually do the calculations, but that requires a lot of data. So, but I'm sure I totally agree with you that the ILO data do not contain as many items as necessary. However, is much better to let's say impute 20 or 30 or 40% of the basket and calculate the rest than just using well, let's say the price index of a very different basket and a very different method to move that basket forward and backward in time. So that's the intention. Is I don't think that the 22 products that exist on average in the ILO data will do the trick. Absolutely not. But they could perhaps do the trick for hopefully the most part.
Interesting. Thanks. So Anna, does that give you a good answer? If so, Jan had a comment in the chat box getting at Bob's use of the dual and thinking about shadow prices and thinking about nutrient contributions to these costs. Bob, do you want to say anything more about the dual solution, the shadow prices, your work in that? I think that was in the AER paper.
No, no, it wasn't. No, so the dual, I mean, So they're shadow prices. Yeah, that's what they are, and is the prices that come out of it. So that the prices. So when you do the dual problem, and so you're assigning values to all the nutrients. Some of the numbers that you get are for some nutrients are positive and some are zero. And the zero ones are the ones that are in excess supply in the least cost primal diet solution, right? Like if there's more protein in the diet that it ends up with and you're setting as a requirement, then its shadow price, which is the price that will come out of the dual problem, is zero. If calories is a binding constraint in the primal problem, and it gets a positive price in the dual problem. So that's one thing that happens. And yeah, so it's telling you, so these values are telling you what having more of that nutrient would be worth in terms of the diet.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I find that the truth is, when I've tried this before, right? And you get these numbers and I just look at them and say, what do they mean? They're just kind of meaningless, like, you know, calories is 10,300. I mean, it doesn't click with anything. So the only way that I can see that I've been able to find where this makes any help and understanding is when it's tied to a specific problem, like what did the potato do for us, right? Then you can include potatoes, remove potatoes, and then you can see and you can measure these, see how the values of the different nutrients change, you know, relative to each other. And then it's these things have a meaning, at least to me. Otherwise, I don't find them meaningful numbers.
Yeah. We did a lot of exploring, and Jan did a lot of exploring in the paper I just entered in the chat box there. I'll toss the DOI link in there too.
Okay.
That paper explored those shadow prices in some detail, and it's extremely interesting to think about the differences between the nutrients that are most scarce, most expensive to meet in linear programming sense, and the ones that have reached the attention of the public health community that are called nutrients of concern, you know, because they're ones that are either immediately identifiable in terms of the consequences of the deficiency, or that are remediable in terms of supplementation, fortification, so forth. So that's why they're of interest, right? So the charismatic famous nutrients are vitamin A, zinc, iron. It's very clear what happens when you don't have enough of them, and they're remediable.
Yeah.
So they're the charismatic ones. But when you do this, you see all sorts of things like calcium. Calcium's super constraining, right? So is it true that everyone is, you know, facing calcium deficiency and osteoporosis and so forth and just undiagnosed? Or is it that these requirements are higher in some sense than they're really needed for longevity in a low income setting or in any setting really? And Jan also entered a slightly different paper, more recent paper. Let me put it in the chat box for everybody, which is looking at variation among type of people. So by age, sex, and then pregnancy and lactation, where when we do the nutrient by nutrient approach, you see very, very striking things in the shadow prices as people go through the life course.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And some of this does seem to have some amount of kind of explanatory power potentially by detecting which nutrients are most expensive in a least cost sense. But you know, it's early days yet in exploiting this capability, which is really remarkably recent, right? This is such an old technique in terms of something that was developed in the 40s. The first paper that I know of to try to use least cost diets to monitor food systems is actually from the famous American agricultural economist Bill Tomick at Cornell. He did a paper that used least cost diet to track food price inflation in the United States. But of course that went nowhere because people had to do it, you know, painstakingly. You know, Bob, you're doing this with Excel, right? We're doing it with our, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times
Yeah.
in order to track each price, each least cost diet in each location. And so it's very early days in terms of thinking about what we can learn from these least cost diets. We're finding food composition is a tremendous hurdle. Just to get the edible portion and the calorie content, let alone the micronutrient content of foods, is very challenging, because when people are
Yeah.
selling a quail, a whole, I don't know, a whole item, in a market, it's very hard to know what's actually in it. So attendees have been very quiet. Please use the chat box, use the Q&A feature. I can see what you type there. If you'd like to share any thoughts. Other panelists have questions for each other, thoughts you want to make sure to share before we go? Marco's a co-author who's been very quiet. So I think this has been a very exciting session. I'm really grateful, Bob, Mikhail, Ash, and Nada for preparing what I think were super interesting slides. I hope the participants got a lot out of this. The recording, I think will be useful for many people who couldn't join to get a sense of this work. Definitely be in touch. I hope that we can build a bigger and bigger and bigger community of people looking at least cost diets and trying to understand how this supply of nutrients and supply of the food groups relates to demand and revealed preference and people not choosing least cost items because they have other things they need. We're doing at Tufts, trying to do some work on meal preparation costs. Huge factor, as Bob, as you mentioned, about sorghum, and then also on preferences and how those may be what stands in the way of acquiring a least cost diet, acquiring a healthy diet from the foods available. But we also know that displacement from new foods seems to be playing a huge, huge role, where people encounter new foods in the market, right? So food, the availability at a grocery store is completely different now, than it was in the 1950s, let alone the 1920s, going back to Mikhail's, let alone the 18th century. And yet the least cost diets aren't that different, right? Even in the grocery store today. So you go to the grocery store today, you get pretty much the same least cost diet food. But so why are so many people who are able to afford least cost diet, like why don't they consume that? Well, lots and lots of reasons, but that we're sort of just beginning to explore. And certainly one of them is the displacement from other foods that are newly arrived. So thanks to everybody. Any last words, Bob? Mikhail?
Well, thank you, Will, for organizing it. You're the intellectual entrepreneur here, so thank you for taking us forward. This is great. Maybe we can keep up this kind of conversation. It'd be good.
Excellent. Yes, I hope so. I hope so. Thanks so much to everybody for joining. Take care then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.